Welcome back, everyone. It's Matthew. In this episode, I'm walking you through what happened when two women with zero high-altitude experience decided their fitness level was enough to get them to 17,200 feet. The guides they hired saw the ending of this story by day 2 and spent the next 4 days trying to rewrite it. It was October 14th, 2016. The Khumbu Valley in northeastern Nepal sits in the shadow of the highest peaks on Earth. Terrain so vast and so indifferent, it doesn't register you as a presence at all. The trail toward the high passes above 15,000 feet is well documented, well traveled, and marked on every trekking app you can download from your couch in Portland. And every single year, it still takes people, not because they were unprepared in the way you'd expect, but because they were certain. And up there, certainty is its own kind of danger. Tina Halvey was 31, ran a Pilates studio in Portland. Small place, loyal clients, the kind of business that runs on word of mouth more than anything else. She had a following online, nothing massive, but the kind of engaged audience that actually buys into what you're selling. Michelle Holt was 28, her business partner and closest friend, and they'd been teaching together long enough that the dynamic between them had basically calcified. Tina led, Michelle followed. You know, the kind of friendship where one person just naturally takes the wheel and the other never really reaches for it? That. Not because Michelle was a pushover, just because that's how it had always been. Physically, these two were no joke. Tina's resting heart rate sat in the low 40s, the kind of number she mentioned often enough that her clients knew it too. Michelle had done 2 triathlons in the past 2 years. They were fit, they knew they were fit, and honestly, that's where the problem starts. Neither of them had any high-altitude experience. Not a gap they were hiding, just something they genuinely didn't think mattered. Tina called the trip a high-altitude wellness challenge, booked through a mid-tier agency, hired 2 Sherpa guides with years on these exact routes, and planned to hit a high pass at roughly 17,200 feet in 8 days. They had budgeted 7. What most people don't think about is how quietly the body is already working against you before anything goes visibly wrong. Above 10,000 feet, the air holds significantly less oxygen per breath. Your lungs pull harder for less return on every inhale. Your heart rate climbs to compensate. Your digestion slows. Your sleep becomes shallow and fragmented even when you feel exhausted. All of it happening invisibly in a body that from the outside still looks like it's performing. The mountain doesn't announce what it's taking from you. It just takes it, and the bill arrives later. October in the Khumbu also means the tail end of the post-monsoon trekking window. Mornings can be clear and beautiful, but weather closes in fast at that elevation, and the gap between a good morning forecast and dangerous afternoon conditions can be a matter of hours. Now think about 2 women who have spent years being told by their own bodies that they are exceptional, who have built their professional identity around physical discipline and the idea that the body responds to the right inputs. That gap between what the mountain was quietly doing and what they believed their conditioning could absorb is where this whole thing lives. And the guides understood that gap from the first day. Tina and Michelle did not. The guides flagged problems from the first full day on trail, and I want to be direct about that because it matters for everything that comes after. These men knew this route. They had seen altitude sickness in every form it takes, in every type of person it takes it from, and they recognized what was developing with Tina and Michelle early. The issue was never that the warnings weren't given. The issue was how those warnings were received. The trailhead sits at just under 9,000 feet, already high enough that the air is thinner, though neither of them would have named it that way. What the guides were watching in those first hours wasn't physical struggle. There wasn't any. It was the way Tina set the pace without discussion, read the trail ahead, and made decisions about it as though the guides were there to carry bags rather than lead a route. By the end of day 1, one of the guides had a clear picture of what the next 7 days were going to look like. It wasn't the picture he'd been hoping for. Below 12,000 feet, they were genuinely strong, better than most groups the guides had worked with, honestly. And that's exactly what made it worse. They felt good, their bodies were performing, and from the inside that felt like proof they were handling this fine. But here's the thing, performing well at 11,000 feet tells you almost nothing about what's coming at 15,000. The body's response to altitude isn't linear, it doesn't scale with fitness, and it doesn't give you a warning before it shifts. Tina and Michelle had no framework for that, and nothing in their experience had ever given them a reason to build one. The standard acclimatization protocol for this route involves deliberate rest days and a climb-high, sleep-low rhythm. You go up during the day, You come back down to sleep at a lower elevation, and you do that repeatedly to give your body time to adjust. The guides introduced this from day 2. Tina acknowledged it, asked a few questions that sounded engaged, and then maintained her own pace anyway. It wasn't a refusal. It was more like she processed the information, filed it somewhere, and continued doing what she had already decided to do. Day 2 is where the dynamic became visible for the first time. The guides called a rest stop at around 11,500 feet. Standard, just a scheduled pause before pushing higher. Tina checked her Garmin, said she felt strong, mentioned her resting numbers, framed the stop as unnecessary in the way people do when they genuinely believe their data is more relevant than yours. The guide said his piece about the pace, about the rest stop, about what the next few days were going to ask of them, and Tina received it the way she received everything, with a nod and a counter that sounded reasonable enough to end the conversation. But what the more experienced guide was actually watching was something subtler. The way Tina made route decisions through a rocky section without consulting anyone, and the way Michelle fell in behind her without question. Not because Michelle couldn't read terrain, but because deferring to Tina was simply what she did. That guide understood right then that any concern he raised would be filtered through Tina first, and Michelle would follow whatever Tina decided. I've seen this dynamic before, the stronger personality setting the ceiling for what the group will tolerate, and it rarely ends with the quieter person pushing back when it matters most. What made it worse was that Michelle had at least one opportunity on day 2 to speak to the guides independently. A stretch of trail where Tina had moved ahead, and Michelle was briefly walking alongside one of the guides without Tina in earshot. He asked how she was feeling. She said she felt good, that she was enjoying it, that the altitude wasn't bothering her yet. It was a perfectly ordinary answer, but the way she gave it, quickly, without hesitation, without any of the small qualifications that people usually offer when they're being honest about physical effort, read less like genuine reassurance and more like a rehearsed response. Like she had already decided what she was going to say before he asked. The guides exchanged a look when the group regrouped, and when the rest stop ended, Tina set the pace for the rest of the day. Their hydration was actually good, consistently good, throughout the trek. That's worth saying because it's one of the few things they were genuinely doing right, and the guides acknowledged it. Their water intake was not the problem. Their food intake was. Tina had been keeping to her usual eating window, intermittent fasting, the same schedule she maintained at home. Michelle had been doing the same for months. At altitude, your body is burning through resources at a rate that has nothing to do with your normal daily output. And restricting the intake window means you are running a deficit that compounds every single day you go higher. The guides raised it. Tina's response was immediate and familiar. She said her body was adapted to it, that she had been eating this way for 2 years without issue, that the adjustment period was normal and she knew how to read her own signals. It was the same collaborative deflection she used for everything else, just applied to food instead of pace. The guides noted it and moved on because by that point, they already knew how those conversations ended. By the end of day 3, the deficit was starting to show. Not dramatically, not in a way that would have alarmed anyone who didn't know what to look for. Michelle's recovery overnight was slower than it should have been. She woke on day 3, already carrying a heaviness in her legs that a full night of sleep hadn't cleared. The kind of fatigue that doesn't respond to rest the way it normally does because the body doesn't have the resources to repair itself. She attributed it to the climb. Tina didn't mention feeling anything similar, and Michelle didn't push the comparison. The guides noticed the way Michelle moved in the first hour of day 3, a slight lag, a fraction more effort per step than the day before, and said nothing yet, because at that point, it was still early and still deniable. That's the other thing I want to describe carefully, because it's easy to paint these women as just arrogant, and that's not quite right. Tina wasn't dismissive in an obvious way. When a guide raised a concern, she didn't wave him off. She would stop, tilt her head slightly, say she understood, and genuinely seemed to sit with it for a few seconds. Then she would offer a counter-suggestion, something that sounded reasonable, something that acknowledged what he said, and then just continue doing what she had already planned. It was collaborative-sounding stubbornness. She made the guide feel heard while completely bypassing what he actually said. Michelle did the same thing, but softer. She would say she actually felt okay right now, as if her current feeling in that specific moment was more reliable data than a decade of experience on that exact mountain. Neither of them ever said no directly. They said maybe or let's see how we feel, and then kept moving. On day 3, at around 13,500 feet, Michelle wrote in her journal that evening that she had a headache. She tracked it, noted the time it started, wrote down what she had eaten. When Tina asked how she was doing, she said she was tired but good. The guides recommended dropping elevation to sleep lower that night. Tina suggested the headache was probably from the dry air. They were hydrating well, after all, and that was the end of the conversation. One of the guides raised the issue again the following morning and was met with the same response. Michelle said she felt fine. Tina said they would monitor it. They kept their elevation that night and moved higher the next day. That night at the wrong elevation, Michelle didn't sleep well. One of the guides noted it. He was a light sleeper, and the restlessness was audible through the tent fabric. She was up at least once in the early hours, which at that elevation costs the body more than most people realize. When she came out of the tent on day 4 morning, the headache was still there, visible in the way she moved, the slight squint against the morning light, the careful way she turned her head. The guides saw it before anyone said a word. The ascent on day 4 was steeper than the previous 2. The terrain was shifting from the lower valley trails into ground that demands more from your legs and your lungs simultaneously. The guides watched Michelle in the first 2 hours of that climb. Her pace was holding, but the effort behind it had changed. She was working harder for the same output, breathing more deliberately, taking slightly longer to recover after the steeper pitches. It wasn't collapse. It wasn't even close to collapse, but it was a body that was no longer absorbing the load the way it had been. That's what made the Diamox conversation that afternoon feel urgent to the guides, rather than routine. They weren't offering it as a precaution anymore. If you're new here, this channel is where we go through cases like this one in full. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Tina declined. She called it a band-aid, not a solution. She was doing breathwork every morning at 14,000 feet instead. Full mobility routine before breakfast. Percussive massager on rest days. Mushroom coffee from a packet she had carried up in her pack. Tina interpreted every physical signal through a fitness lens. Headache was dehydration. Fatigue was the body adjusting. Any dizziness was low blood sugar. She had a framework for her body that had served her well for years at sea level, and she was applying it at 14,000 feet with complete confidence. The framework was wrong for this environment, but it was hers, and it was coherent, and that made it very hard to argue against. What I find myself wondering is whether Michelle would have taken it if she'd been asked separately. The guides offered Diamox to the group, and Tina answered for the group, and Michelle said nothing. Whether that silence was agreement or something else is impossible to know. But the guides noticed it, the way Michelle's eyes moved briefly to the medication before Tina spoke, and then away again, once the decision had been made. It was a small thing, the kind of small thing that only means something in retrospect. That evening, after the Diamox refusal, one of the guides sat with the situation seriously for the first time. Not the first time he had concerns. Those had been building since day 2, but the first time he weighed whether to continue. He had watched Michelle's movement that day, watched the way she managed the steeper sections with more deliberate effort than the day before, watched Tina interpret all of it as normal adjustment. What he was seeing in both of them, the pace, the food restriction, the refusal of medication, the headache that had now been present for over 24 hours, was a picture he recognized from previous seasons on this route. The guides discussed it that night. The decision to stay came down to one thing. They believed that as long as they were present, they could intervene if it became critical. That calculation would hold for 2 more days before it ran out of room. The morning of day 5, before the group was up, the guides had already been awake for a while. They didn't need to discuss much. They had said what needed to be said the night before. What passed between them that morning was quieter than that, more practical. They had made a decision to stay, and now they were adjusting how they worked within it. Staying closer, watching more carefully, being more deliberate about positioning on the trail. Neither of them said anything to Tina or Michelle about it. There was nothing left to say that hadn't already been said and set aside. Day 5 was not a gentle day on the route. The elevation gain pushed them from just under 15,000 feet to the ridgeline at 15,800, and the terrain between those 2 points is exposed and technically demanding in a way the lower sections weren't. The guides knew what that day was asking of a well-rested, well-fed group moving at a sensible pace. What they had instead were 2 women on day 5 of a caloric deficit, one of whom had been symptomatic for 2 days, moving at a pace that left no margin. That's the context for everything that happened on that ridgeline. They stopped for nearly 20 minutes longer than they should have at 15,800 feet. One of the guides asked them to move twice. Tina handed him her trekking pole to hold so she could get a cleaner shot. He held it. He told the people who interviewed him afterward that he didn't know what else to do at that point. They were clients, not prisoners, and short of physically pulling them off the ridge, his options were limited. And honestly, reading that account, I think he's right. What do you do when someone hands you their trekking pole and turns their back? When they finally moved off the ridgeline, Tina set the pace downward, the same way she set it for everything else, without discussion, without checking in. She didn't seem aware of how long they had stopped. Michelle fell in behind her, and for a few minutes the descent looked normal. Then the guides noticed the change, not in Tina, in Michelle, a slight inward quality to how she was moving, like someone managing something they hadn't named yet. One of the guides slowed his pace to stay closer to her on the way down. She didn't acknowledge it, didn't ask for it, but she also didn't pull ahead the way she normally would have. That was the last real window, the last point at which turning around, dropping elevation, stopping lower for the night would have changed what happened the following morning. Nobody made that call, and by the time camp was set up, the window had closed. That evening at camp, Michelle filmed a short video. She looked pale. Her eyes were slightly glassy, that kind of flatness that doesn't read as tired, it reads as something else entirely. She said she was feeling the altitude, but in a good way. Both guides are visible in the background of that clip, and I wonder what was going through their heads watching her say that on camera. Later that night, Michelle had her journal open. She had written that she felt off, not sick exactly, just off. She looked up at Tina, and there was a pause. Tina was already talking about the next section, how close they were, how the hardest part was almost behind them. Michelle closed the journal. She never said what she had written. That sentence she never spoke is the one that sits heaviest when I go back through this. What happened through the rest of that night matters. Michelle didn't sleep well. The guides were aware of it. One of them was a light sleeper and noted the restlessness. She was up at least once in the early hours, which at that elevation and in those temperatures costs the body more than most people realize. By the time morning came, she hadn't eaten a real meal since the previous afternoon, hadn't slept more than a few broken hours, and had been symptomatic for going on 3 days. Before the group stirred, the guides were already awake and already watching the tent. They had been through the calculation the night before, and they knew what the morning was going to show them. When Michelle came out of the tent, it showed them exactly that. The morning of October 19th, day 6, the camp was cold. The kind of cold that gets into your gear overnight and takes the first hour of movement to shake. The sky was clear, visibility sharp, the peaks catching early light in a way that made the conditions look more forgiving than they were. Michelle was slow getting ready, not dramatically, just a beat behind, the kind of lag that reads as tiredness until you know what you're looking at. One of the guides watched her pack her bag and said nothing. The weather report showed a stable morning with deteriorating conditions expected by early afternoon. Tina read it, noted the window, and suggested they leave early to get ahead of the weather. It was a reasonable instinct. The problem was the pace she set to execute it. They were moving toward the high pass at 17,200 feet, and within the first hour, Tina had pushed out ahead of the group. The guides kept Michelle between them and tried to close the gap. The terrain made it difficult to maintain visual contact for long stretches. This is not flat ground. This is not a clear sight line. This is broken, high-altitude terrain where someone can be 30 feet ahead of you and completely out of view. Michelle's deterioration during that ascent was not sudden. The guides were watching it happen in increments. Her response time when they spoke to her lagging by a second, longer than it should, her footing becoming less precise on the uneven ground. A change in her breathing that had shifted from the controlled rhythm she'd maintained on the lower sections. At some point above 16,000 feet, one of the guides made the decision to slow his pace entirely and stay within arm's reach of her, rather than continue trying to close the gap with Tina. He could not manage both. He chose the one he could still reach. I think about that decision sometimes, not as a failure, but as the moment where the situation finally became larger than anyone's ability to contain it. Above 16,500 feet, Tina's GPS data, recovered later from her phone, shows her pace dropping significantly, and then the track starts to drift, left of the marked route, gradually at first, 50 feet off the marked route, then further, gradual enough that nothing about it would have felt wrong from the inside. At that stage of oxygen deprivation, spatial awareness degrades in ways that aren't obvious from the inside. You are moving, you feel like you are moving correctly, and the part of your brain that would normally catch a navigational error has already been quietly affected. She would not have known she was off trail. The cornice was not visible from above. It was a snow shelf extending out over a rocky couloir, and from the approach angle she was on, it looked like a continuous slope. There was no visual cue that would have told her what was underneath. When it gave way, the collapse was fast. She fell approximately 290 feet into the couloir below, impacting rock and ice at the base. Michelle was behind her, following Tina's footprints in the snow. When the guides reached her, she was approximately 80 feet from the cornice edge, sitting down in the snow. Her speech was slow, her coordination severely impaired when they tried to help her stand. She lost consciousness within minutes. One guide stayed with her while the other used the satellite communicator to call for evacuation. The weather had already closed in. At that elevation, rescue operations sit at the outer limit of what most aircraft can reliably perform, even in clear conditions, and the window that morning was gone. By the time conditions allowed for a response, Michelle had been unconscious in sub-freezing temperatures on an exposed slope for close to 3 hours. Michelle Holt was pronounced dead before the evacuation team reached her position. The coroner listed the cause of death as high-altitude cerebral edema, compounded by severe hypothermia and cardiac arrest. Her journal, recovered from her pack, documented symptoms going back at least 2.5 days before the incident. The GPS data from her phone, the time-stamped photos, the video filmed at camp the night before, all of it produced a timeline that was consistent and clear. Contributing factors included failure to acclimatize, inadequate caloric intake at elevation, and delayed recognition of AMS progression. Tina Halvey's body was recovered from the couloir 2 days later, when weather cleared enough for a ground team to reach the area. Cause of death was blunt force trauma, consistent with a fall from significant elevation. The cornice collapse was confirmed by the physical evidence at the site. Her phone was recovered with her. The last photo on it was time-stamped 9:47 a.m., taken at approximately 16,200 feet. Her GPS track shows the deviation from the marked route beginning roughly 40 minutes after that photo was taken. The case was ruled accidental. The guides were cleared of any negligence. Their accounts matched the recovered evidence exactly, and the timeline confirmed that concerns had been raised at multiple points across the 6 days. The agency conducted an internal review. No criminal findings were made.